In the capitals of Europe and America, the cameras flashed, the anchors smiled, and the numbers rolled off their tongues like a hymn. Billions of dollars erased, debt forgiven, Africa redeemed. That was the headline. They called it relief. They called it renewal. They called it mercy. Yet in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré did not join the applause. He clenched his fist, for he knew that nothing offered freely comes without a price, and this price was not measured in paper. It was measured in the lifeblood of a continent: gold, oil, uranium. What the world was hailing as liberation was, in truth, a quiet trap. The signatures on those contracts did not cancel chains. They reforged them. But this is not the story of another nation falling silently into debt. This is the story of a young leader who dared to expose the bargain, who placed the evidence in the hands of his people, and who asked the one question that echoes still. If a small landlocked country can say no, what stops the rest of Africa? Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a turning point in history. Subscribe now and walk with us into the truth that follows. The announcement fell across Africa like rain on parched soil. In Dar es Salaam, ministers smiled as they spoke of $2 billion in debt erased. In Kinshasa, officials traded copper and cobalt for what they called stability. Along the coast, governments pledged offshore crude as collateral, convinced that prosperity was finally within reach. Cameras captured the handshakes. Western diplomats raised glasses at receptions, draped in flags and soft words. Relief, renewal, partnership. Yet in Ouagadougou, the scene was different. Ibrahim Traoré sat in a dimly lit room, elbows on the table, eyes fixed on the newsreels. He had seen this choreography before. The photo opportunities, the carefully drafted talking points, the sudden generosity of foreign credit lines timed perfectly when a government was gasping for air. And always behind the smiles, a clause hidden in the fine print. This time, the fine print was sharper than ever. Commodities secured stabilization, resource-backed amortization. Phrases that sounded harmless to the public, but whispered danger to those who knew. In practice, they meant Africa's gold, oil, and uranium were no longer shields of sovereignty, but bargaining chips pledged to the ledgers of London and New York. Contracts designed in distant capitals would determine the price of African resources, regardless of African markets. Why collateralize what we already own to cancel what we never spent? Traoré asked quietly, his voice carrying both suspicion and fatigue. A minister across the table cleared his throat, hesitant. Mr. President, they are not approaching you directly. They know your stance. Traoré leaned back. Exactly. They are circling us through our neighbors, knowing that one signature in Bamako or Kinshasa could corner us in Ouagadougou. It was not the money that disturbed him. Burkina Faso had lived with scarcity for decades. It was the principle. To sign such contracts was to admit that dignity could be traded, that sovereignty had a price set in someone else's marketplace. For other leaders, weary of empty coffers and restless citizens, the bait seemed irresistible. New loans, quick relief, foreign praise, oxygen for struggling treasuries. But for Traoré, it was something darker. A net disguised as a gift, a colonization without soldiers, dressed in the garments of kindness. So he acted, not with speeches or declarations, but with silence and resolve. He called together a midnight council, a handful of economists, auditors, and intelligence officers. In that small room, beneath the buzzing of a single overhead light, he spoke plainly. We form a unit. Quiet, fast, relentless. Follow the money. If this is clean, we will see it. If it is a trap, we will feel the pull. And so the Financial Investigations Unit was born. 12 people, no fanfare, no official stamp, armed only with determination and the knowledge that Africa's future might rest on their findings. They traced the wires of promised funds and discovered detours through expensive Western clearinghouses. They scrutinized consulting fees shaved off before a single school could be funded. They studied valuation clauses that shifted like sand. When gold rose in value, the obligations expanded. When oil fell, the collateral commitments deepened. One analyst, a young woman from Kaya, stared at the spreadsheets until dawn. Finally, she whispered what others had feared. They are locking us to their prices. Even when we win, we lose. The evidence mounted. The signatures of relief began to look more like signatures of surrender. And then, buried deep within a string of emails exchanged between IMF officials and a private consultancy, a name appeared that froze the room. The subject line read, Phoenix Architecture. The memo described a digital settlement layer tied to baskets of commodities, oil, gold, uranium. And scrawled in the margins of a partner document was a note that changed everything. Advisory DJ Trump. The room fell silent. For weeks the unit worked in shadows, piecing together fragments of contracts, tracing the movements of funds, and mapping the web of consultancies. But it was that single page, Phoenix Dollar Commodity Stabilization Thesis, that transformed suspicion into certainty. The discovery was not just technical, it was political, and it was explosive. The implications were staggering. This was not simply debt relief, it was the architecture of a new currency, one that would wear the stars and stripes of American ambition. Without Africa's resources, it was just a dream on paper. With Africa's resources, it could be marketed as invincible, a digital coin backed not by code alone, but by barrels of oil and veins of gold. Traore exhaled through his nose. They have learned from the last fight. No sanctions at ports. No soldiers at borders. They will bind us with signatures. Advisors urged him to go public immediately, but Traore shook his head. Truth shouted too early is dismissed as anger. Truth delivered with evidence becomes judgment. We need the chain, contracts, wires, intermediaries, signatures. When we speak, we must not miss. In capitals across Africa, leaders who had signed agreements basked in applause. In Paris, an anchor asked if the Burkinabe president was too inexperienced to grasp the complexities of global finance. In Washington, the IMF paraded its historic initiative. Yet in Ouagadougou, the square was filling with anticipation. Word had spread that Traore would speak not of hope, but of evidence. Farmers dusted their hats. Students carried notebooks. Miners came still in their work clothes. Loudspeakers were strung between lampposts. Radios tuned in. When he stepped onto the stage, he carried not a script but a folder. His voice cut through the humid air. They call it debt relief. But what is relief that demands our gold? What is freedom that chains our oil? Today, I will not give you slogans. I will give you contracts. Page after page, clause after clause, he read aloud. Uranium pledged as collateral. Adjustable valuation rights that tilted against Africa. Consultancy fees siphoned before aid touched a single classroom. And finally, the slide. Phoenix Dollar Commodity Stabilization Thesis, with Donald Trump's name on the advisory line. The crowd gasped. They are not canceling debt, he declared, voice rising. They are drafting a new currency built on our backs. They call it innovation. I call it a coup without soldiers. For a moment, silence lay heavy as stone. And then the roar broke. Chants rolled through the square. Cancel the contracts! Cancel the chains! The broadcast went viral within hours. In Bamako, students replayed the speech on giant screens. In Nairobi, miners marched with placards reading, "Our uranium is not your guarantee." Even in capitals where governments had signed IMF deals, opposition figures seized the revelations, waving copies of contracts in parliaments and demanding answers. Western media scrambled. IMF spokespeople denied that the Phoenix Project was linked to debt relief, but the documents circulated online in French, Arabic, and Swahili. Ordinary people read the clauses with their own eyes. They did not need pundits to interpret chains written so plainly. Donald Trump himself broke silence on television. This young man in Burkina Faso does not understand finance. He should thank us. Without America, Africa is nothing. But his words backfired. On African radio stations, callers repeated his sentence with fury. They want us to thank them for stealing from us, one said bitterly. The IMF tightened its grip. Contracts were reinforced. Grain shipments were mysteriously delayed. Insurance rates for Sahel exports spiked. Fear became the chosen weapon. Yet fear met resistance. In Ouagadougou, neighborhood groups formed vigilance committees to track rumors. Students launched social media campaigns debunking IMF talking points line by line. Activists declared, better hungry and free than fed with chains. Across the continent, what began as a murmur was turning into a roar. And in Brussels, one European banker admitted in private what none would say aloud. The Africans have caught us. If more contracts collapse, the whole structure falls. But the real turning point was yet to come. For as the IMF doubled down, Traore was preparing something even bolder. Not just a speech, but a summit. Relief, they called it. Yet in the markets of Ouagadougou, bread still cost more than the day before. In rural clinics, mothers still waited for medicines that never arrived. In classrooms, teachers still received salaries weeks late. The promise of oxygen for treasuries had not reached the lungs of the people. Instead, the contracts tightened like ropes. The IMF reacted swiftly after Traore's revelations. Disbursements were delayed without explanation. Grain shipments bound for the Sahel were mysteriously held up in European ports. Insurance premiums for exports doubled overnight. It was a squeeze designed not to punish governments, but to remind ordinary families who held the keys to their survival. But something unexpected happened. Rather than collapsing under the weight of fear, society adapted. Neighborhood groups in Ouagadougou formed vigilance committees, tracking rumors and exposing provocateurs. Students organized digital platforms where they debunked IMF talking points clause by clause. Local radio hosts read the contracts aloud, line after line, inviting farmers and miners to judge for themselves. The message spread. Africa was no longer an audience. It was the jury. In Dar es Salaam, protests forced the government to suspend its IMF agreement pending review. In Kinshasa, opposition leaders demanded the annulment of contracts signed in haste. In Senegal, lawmakers rebelled against their own ministers. What had begun as a lone speech in Burkina Faso was fast becoming a continental reckoning. The IMF, once confident of its hold, grew nervous. In a leaked call, one official confessed, "We underestimated him. He has turned the narrative. What was debt relief is now colonialism." Investors behind the Phoenix dollar, the very project Donald Trump had envisioned as his answer to China's digital yuan, began to question whether Africa could still be secured as the anchor. Without commodities, the digital coin was just code. With resistance spreading, code alone would not suffice. For Burkina Faso, the pressure was relentless. Fuel prices climbed. Red lines at ration stations lengthened. Schools shortened hours to conserve resources. Families began to cut meals in half. Yet among the hardships, a new spirit had taken hold. A woman told a reporter, "Better hungry and free than fed with chains?" Her words echoed across radio stations, a defiant refrain against despair. Politically, the landscape shifted. Governments once eager to sign IMF agreements now faced the fury of their own people. Parliaments became battlegrounds. Ministers were grilled on live broadcasts, some stammering that they had not read the fine print, others insisting that contracts were misunderstood. Few were believed. Opposition figures seized the moment, branding the agreements as instruments of surrender. It was here that the phrase Ibrahim Traoré coup began circulating, not in the sense of a military putsch, but as a revolution of truth, a coup against deception. The young leader of Burkina Faso had overthrown not a government, but a narrative that had long bound Africa to the margins of global finance. The international pressure only reinforced his message. Each delay, each sanction, each tightened clause became proof of what he had warned, that the relief was a ransom dressed in polite words. The harder they squeezed, the more defiant the people became. And then came the breaking point. In parliaments across the continent, opposition leaders began waving copies of the Phoenix documents, demanding their governments explain why Africa's gold, oil, and uranium had been pledged to finance someone else's currency. Crowds gathered outside chanting the same words that had first erupted in Ouagadougou. Cancel the contracts. Cancel the chains. What had been born in the streets of Burkina Faso was now a continental fire. Governments could no longer pretend that contracts signed in quiet rooms would stay hidden. Africa was awake. But Traore knew that speeches and protests alone were not enough. If Africa was to withstand the storm, it needed more than defiance. It needed unity. And so, as governments faltered and contracts trembled, he turned his eyes beyond Ouagadougou, toward Bamako, where a gathering of Sahel nations was being prepared, one that could alter the balance forever. The shockwaves of Ouagadougou traveled far beyond the Sahel. In Addis Ababa, the African Union convened an emergency session where diplomats debated whether the IMF contracts represented opportunity or betrayal. Some urged caution. Africa still needed credit lines to weather food and energy crises. Others, emboldened by Traore's evidence, demanded a collective stance. If one of us is chained, none of us is free. In Abuja, ECOWAS faced its own dilemma. Several member states had already signed IMF agreements and feared the political cost of reversing course. Yet the streets of Dakar, Niamey, and Conakry were alive with chants that governments could no longer ignore. What began as a national rebellion was morphing into a regional force, a pressure from below that no leader could dismiss. Across the Mediterranean, Europe's response was fractured. In Paris, officials attempted to downplay the documents, insisting that Burkina Faso was misinformed. Yet behind closed doors, bankers admitted the danger. If these contracts unravel, investor confidence will collapse, one leaked memo revealed. In Brussels, policymakers whispered the same. Africa's refusal to collateralize its resources threatened not just the IMF's credibility, but Europe's economic foothold on the continent. In Washington, Donald Trump's fury was unmistakable. At rallies, he accused Traore of sabotaging global progress. In private, he pressed allies to tighten the noose. Sanctions, asset freezes, diplomatic isolation. Break him before others follow, he demanded. But instead of weakening Traore, each threat reinforced his story. Africans now saw proof that what was branded as relief was, in reality, ransom. The IMF issued denials, calling the Phoenix dollar a misinterpretation. Yet ordinary Africans had already seen the documents for themselves. They did not need analysts to interpret what their eyes could read. Grain shipments delayed, fuel prices inflated, contracts drafted in secret. These were not misunderstandings. These were chains. And so the narrative shifted. What Western officials called debt relief was increasingly seen as economic colonization. What began as the resistance of one nation was now being spoken of as the Burkina Faso Revolution, a revolt not of guns and barricades, but of truth, dignity, and transparency. In Bamako, preparations were underway. Leaders from across the Sahel would soon gather, and the world would be forced to watch. For the first time in decades, Africa was not waiting for instructions. It was preparing to write its own script. The city of Bamako had never seen such a gathering. Flags of Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and Guinea fluttered side by side. Delegations from other African states watched closely, their eyes fixed on a stage where history was being scripted. This was not another conference of borrowed phrases and borrowed funds. It was a declaration that Africa would no longer mortgage its future for promises drafted abroad. When Ibrahim Traoré rose to speak, the hall fell silent. Cameras broadcast his words across the continent. Wahkiyoum, we have shown the fraud. We have shown the chains hidden in relief. Now we must act. Alone they can punish us. Together they cannot touch us. The applause thundered like a drumbeat echoing through Sahel valleys. By the end of the summit, a joint resolution had been passed. Member states pledged to review, suspend, or cancel IMF agreements containing clauses that collateralize resources. They promised to explore regional alternatives for financing, drawing interest from BRICS and Gulf partners eager to provide credit without gold or oil as collateral. For decades, Africa's responses had been fractured, state by state, capital by capital. Now, for the first time, a bloc openly rejected the terms of the IMF. On the ground, solidarity deepened. Farmers transported grain across borders to ease shortages. Students ran social media campaigns linking cities with a common refrain: better to lose their loans than to lose our future. Local radio stations reminded listeners that sovereignty was not a commodity to be priced in London. In Ouagadougou, an old man summed it up simply: we are not rich, but we are awake. In Western capitals, analysts warned of blowback. We risk pushing Africa into rival systems, a London newspaper admitted. Investors who once praised the IMF's initiative now grew restless. Without African commodities, the Phoenix dollar lacked credibility. Quietly, some began to withdraw. Trump raged from podiums, threatening tariffs on African exports, freezing reserves in European banks, and blacklisting Sahel ports. But these threats rang hollow against a continent that had already glimpsed the truth. Every new threat became another proof of what Traoré had said in Ouagadougou, that this was not relief, but ransom. And yet, even as hope surged, the cost was real. Families still rationed grain. Schools still struggled to keep doors open. Governments faced difficult choices between survival and defiance. The road ahead was steep, uncertain, and lined with obstacles. But for the first time in a generation, the path was chosen by Africans themselves, not dictated from elsewhere. The question that now echoed across the continent was no longer, can we survive? But rather, can we endure long enough to build something stronger? By the year's end, the Phoenix dollar lay in ruins. The contracts hailed as historic relief had unraveled under the weight of their own deception. Investors retreated, IMF officials scrambled for explanations, and in Washington, anger turned into frustration. Yet in Africa, the story was told differently. The continent had stared into the trap, and for the first time in decades, stepped back together. Burkina Faso did not receive billions in relief. No flood of credit rushed into Ouagadougou. Ships of grain still arrived late, and families still tightened belts. On paper, it looked like defeat, but the reality was far greater. What had been won was not measured in dollars, but in dignity. For the first time, Africans had examined the fine print and said no. They had chosen hunger over humiliation, truth over silence. At the closing of the Sahel summit, Traoré's words resonated like scripture. They thought our silence was ignorance. They thought our hunger was weakness. But hunger has not broken us. Silence has not blinded us. We have seen their contracts. We have read their lies. And today, Africa cancels not just their agreements, but the very idea that our resources are theirs to command. Crowds erupted. Farmers held up sheaves of grain. Miners lifted helmets. Students raised notebooks as if they were banners of a new dawn. Across cities and villages, the refrain was the same. We are no longer chained. This was the essence of the Burkina Faso Revolution. A revolt not of guns, but of voices, a declaration that sovereignty was no longer for sale. Historians may one day call it the Ibrahim Traoré coup, not a coup of tanks and barracks, but of contracts and clauses. A coup that overthrew deception with evidence, that replaced resignation with resistance. And in telling the truth, Traoré achieved what weapons and sanctions could not. He united a continent around the conviction that dignity is priceless. This is the legacy that endures. Not canceled debts, but awakened citizens. Not a failed currency, but a continent that stood tall. And so the question remains, if one small landlocked nation could ignite this fire, what stops the rest of Africa from carrying the torch? If this story moves your spirit, do not let it fade. Comment, share, and subscribe, because the struggle for sovereignty is not over, and your voice is part of the chorus that keeps Africa unchained.